August 18th, 1966, 6 Australian soldiers were silently watching through the jungle foliage as over 600 Viet Cong fighters gathered below them, completely unaware they were being hunted. What happened in the next 14 minutes would shatter an entire enemy regiment and rewrite the rules of jungle warfare. But how did just 6 men destroy a force 100 times their size without firing a single shot themselves? The air was so thick you could almost chew it. 95 degrees, and the humidity made it feel like breathing underwater. 6 men from 3 Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment, sat in the shade of a canvas tent, checking their weapons one more time. Sweat already soaked through their uniforms, even though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. The smell of gun oil, mixed with red dirt and rotting jungle plants, hung over everything. These 6 Australians were about to walk into the jungle, and what they would do there in the next day would destroy an entire enemy regiment in just 14 minutes. But they didn't know that yet. Right now, they only knew that somewhere out in that green hell, hundreds of Viet Cong soldiers were gathering for an attack. The patrol commander was a sergeant who had fought in Malaya years before. He knew the jungle. He knew how it could hide an army or swallow a single man without a trace. His 5 soldiers were all SAS qualified, which meant they had survived some of the hardest training in the world. Most of them had been to Vietnam before. They had been out in the bush for 2 straight weeks already, moving slowly through the jungle, watching and listening. That was the Australian way, not the American way. Intelligence reports said that D445 Battalion and 275 VC Regiment were massing in the jungle somewhere east of the base, maybe 4 kilometers out. That meant somewhere between 600 and 800 enemy fighters, all gathering in one place. The reports said they were planning a major assault, maybe in the next 2 days. The Australian task force had about 4,500 men total, but they were spread out across multiple bases and operational areas. If 600 VC hit them all at once in one spot, it could be a disaster. The patrol commander looked at his map one more time. The long high hills rose up to the east, covered in jungle so thick that at noon it looked like dusk underneath the canopy. Trees grew so close together, you sometimes had to turn sideways to squeeze between them. Vines hung down like curtains. The ground was a mix of red clay that stuck to your boots and rotting leaves that made every step quiet but slippery. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Maybe it was the monsoon rolling in. Maybe it was B-52 bombers hitting targets near the Cambodian border. Sometimes, you couldn't tell the difference. Each man carried an SLR rifle or an M16. They had claymore mines strapped to their packs, spare magazines in every pocket, grenades hanging from their webbing, the weight pressed down, on shoulders that were already tired from 2 weeks in the field. But that weight was also comfort. Every bullet, every grenade, every mine was something between you and the enemy. The Viet Cong weren't just farmers with old rifles anymore. D445 Battalion was a main force unit with mortars, recoilless rifles, and soldiers who knew how to use them. They had been fighting for years, some of them since the war against the French. The 275 Regiment had fought at a place called ANZAC and had won. They knew the jungle better than almost anyone. They moved at night like ghosts. They could set an ambush that you wouldn't see until it was too late. They owned this territory, or at least they thought they did. The Americans had been trying a different approach. They would send whole companies into the jungle, sometimes 30 men, sometimes more than 100. They moved fast, trying to find the enemy and force them into a fight. They wanted contact. They wanted body count. They wanted to prove they were winning. But all that noise, all those men crashing through the bush, it gave the VC hours of warning. By the time the Americans arrived, the enemy was already gone, melted back into the jungle, or hidden in tunnel complexes that could survive even bombs. The Australians had learned something different in places like Malaya and Borneo. In the jungle, the side that sees first wins. The side that hears first wins. The side that shoots first wins. It wasn't about being aggressive or brave. was about being invisible and patient. Small patrols, moving slow, watching everything. That was how you found the enemy before they found you. Late in the afternoon of August 17th, this same 6-man patrol had moved into a rubber plantation east of Nui Dat. Rubber trees grew in neat rows, planted by the French decades ago. The ground was more open there, easier to move through than primary jungle. They were looking for signs of enemy movement, anything that would tell them where the VC were gathering. The point man, the soldier walking first, suddenly froze. He raised his fist, the signal to stop. Every man behind him stopped moving instantly, becoming still as statues. The point man knelt down slowly and looked at the trail. Fresh footprints, sandal prints, the kind the VC made from old tire rubber. Not just one or two, dozens of them, crossing the trail in both directions. The dirt in the prints was still damp and loose. These weren't hours old, they were minutes old. The patrol commander moved forward quietly and knelt beside the point man. He studied the tracks. His mind raced through the possibilities. The intelligence had said the VC were massing 4 kilometers away. But these tracks told a different story. The enemy wasn't 4 kilometers away anymore. They were right here. Close enough that the patrol might have walked right into them. Close enough that somewhere nearby, maybe just a few hundred meters through the trees, hundreds of enemy soldiers were gathering. This was the moment everything changed. The patrol could have radioed back to base immediately. They could have called for helicopter gunships or artillery strikes. They could have set up an ambush right there on the trail and killed the next group of VC that walked past. But the patrol commander made a different choice, one that went against every aggressive instinct drilled into soldiers. He decided to follow the tracks. He decided to find out where all these VC were going. Because if there were dozens of footprints here, there might be hundreds of soldiers at the end of that trail. And if they could find exactly where those hundreds of soldiers were sleeping, eating, and preparing for their attack, then the Australian artillery back at base could do something the VC would never forget. The 6 men began to move again, even slower now, following the trail of footprints deeper into the jungle. It was late afternoon. They had all night to track this enemy force to wherever it was going, and by morning they would know exactly where to strike. Through the fading afternoon light and into the darkness of night, the 6 Australians followed those tracks. For 14 hours they moved, from late afternoon on August 17th until dawn on August 18th, one foot in front of the other. Stop, listen, watch, move 50 meters, stop again. The jungle pressed in from all sides, hot and wet and alive with sounds that could be birds or could be VC signals. Every step had to be silent. Every breath had to be controlled. One broken twig, one cough, one careless footfall could give them away. And if 600 enemy soldiers discovered 6 Australians in their midst, those Australians would simply disappear. The patrol moved in a way that would have seemed crazy to most soldiers. They didn't rush. They didn't try to cover ground quickly. In 14 hours, they moved less than 2 kilometers. That's about 1 mile. A person could walk that distance in 20 minutes on a road. But this wasn't a road, and speed would get them killed. The Australian method was built on patience. Watch more than you move. Listen more than you talk. See the enemy before the enemy sees you. American patrols in the same jungle moved completely differently. They would cover 4 to 6 kilometers in a day, sometimes more. They moved with 30 or 40 men, sometimes even more than that. All those soldiers meant noise, equipment rattling, men whispering, boots breaking branches, radio squawk. The VC could hear them coming from a kilometer away, sometimes more. By the time the Americans reached an area, the enemy had already vanished like smoke. But 6 men moving slowly, that was different. 6 men could be silent. 6 men could slip between the trees like shadows. 6 men could stop for 10 minutes just to listen to the jungle and figure out what belonged and what didn't. A bird call that was just slightly wrong. A smell of rice cooking where no village should be. A broken branch that was bent the wrong way. These were the things that kept you alive. Every 30 minutes, the patrol commander whispered into his radio just a few words: grid coordinates showing their position, estimates of enemy strength based on the tracks, direction of movement. The radio operator back at base marked everything on a map, watching the patrol's slow progress deeper into enemy territory. By dawn on August 18th, the patrol had found what they were looking for. The VC assembly area was in a rubber plantation 2.5 kilometers east of the Australian base. Through the trees, moving carefully from shadow to shadow, the patrol got within 150 meters of the enemy position, close enough to hear voices talking in Vietnamese, close enough to smell cooking fires and cigarette smoke, close enough to see movement between the trees. The VC had gathered in a space about 400 meters square, roughly the size of 4 football fields, and in that space, over 600 soldiers were preparing for war. This was the backwards part, the part that felt wrong to every aggressive instinct. The 6 Australians could have opened fire. They had automatic weapons. They had grenades. From ambush position with surprise on their side, they could have killed 20 or 30 VC easily. That would have been a victory by most measures. That would have been something to report back to headquarters with pride. But the patrol commander knew that killing 30 men meant losing 600. If they opened fire, the VC would scatter into the jungle. Some would die, but most would escape. The intelligence would be lost, the target would disappear, and the 6 Australians would probably die too, because you don't shoot at 600 men and expect to walk away. So instead, they watched, they counted, they marked positions on their maps. They noted where the VC had dug bunkers and where they had stacked ammunition. They saw mortars and recoilless rifles and boxes of rifle ammunition. They saw soldiers cleaning weapons and eating rice and sleeping in the shade. The VC felt safe here. They had sentries posted, sure, but those sentries were watching for big threats. They were watching for helicopters and large patrols and armored vehicles. They weren't watching for 6 men lying perfectly still in the undergrowth 150 meters away. The math was simple but brutal. 6 men versus 600. 1 against 100. In a straight fight, the Australians would last maybe 5 minutes before being completely overrun. But this wasn't going to be a straight fight. The patrol had found the target. Now they just needed to call in the hammer. The training that made this possible had taken months. These SAS soldiers had spent weeks in the Australian rainforest learning to move without sound. They learned to read the jungle like a book. A bent leaf told you someone had passed recently. Crushed grass showed direction of Viet travel. Broken spiderwebs meant someone had walked through in the last few hours. They learned to tell the difference between a real bird call and a VC signal. They learned to trust their ears more than their eyes, because in thick jungle you heard the enemy before you saw them. They also learned to think like hunters instead of soldiers. Soldiers want to fight. Hunters want to watch and wait and strike at exactly the right moment. Soldiers count success by how many enemies they kill face to face. Hunters count success by whether they go home alive with the target eliminated. The Australian method was about being a hunter in a war full of soldiers. The VC had made one huge mistake. They thought safety came from numbers. 600 men felt strong. 600 men felt unbeatable. Who would dare attack 600 well-armed, experienced fighters in their own territory? The VC had beaten the French. They had survived American bombing campaigns. They had won battles against much larger forces. They had reason to be confident, but confidence made them careless. They concentrated in one place. They built cooking fires that made smoke. They talked in normal voices instead of whispers. They stacked all their ammunition together instead of spreading it out. They thought the jungle protected them, and it did, but only from enemies they could see coming. It didn't protect them from 6 ghosts with radios who could bring down fire from the sky. The patrol commander looked at his map one more time. He measured the distance from their position to the VC concentration. he measured the distance from the VC concentration back to the Australian artillery at Nui Dat Base, 2.8 kilometres, well within range of the 105mm howitzers. He looked at his watch, 6:45 in the morning. He picked up the radio handset and began to whisper the coordinates. Fire mission. Priority target, 600 enemy soldiers in the open. The artillery crews back at base heard those words and began to run. At Nui Dat Base, the artillery crews were already moving before the radio call finished. 4 105mm howitzers, big guns that could throw a shell 10 kilometres or more. The crews had been waiting, ready, knowing that somewhere out in the jungle, their scout patrol was hunting something big. When the call came through with coordinates and the words priority target, they knew this was the moment. The guns were already loaded. Each howitzer had a crew of 6 men who had practiced this routine 1,000 times. Load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. Over and over until the barrel was too hot to touch. They could put a shell in the air every 15 seconds if they had to, and today they were going to have to. At 6:47 in the morning, the first ranging shot left the barrel. The sound was a deep, hollow thump that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. The shell arced up into the sky, spinning as it flew, travelling, faster than sound. Back in the rubber plantation, the 6 Australian scouts lay flat behind whatever cover they could find. They watched the tree line 200 metres away, where over 600 VC soldiers were waking up, eating breakfast, checking weapons, getting ready for their planned attack on the Australian base. At 6:49, the ranging shell came down. The explosion was a sharp crack, followed by a bloom of smoke and dirt, but it hit 50 metres short of the target. The patrol commander was already on the radio with the correction, add 50, fire for effect. Those words meant stop testing and start destroying. Fire for effect meant throw everything you have at this target. At 6:51, the artillery commander back at base spoke into his radio. Shot out. That meant 4 shells were in the air, all aimed at the same spot, all carrying high explosive warheads that would detonate on impact. At 6:52, the jungle erupted. 4 artillery shells landed at almost the same instant in the middle of the VC concentration area. The sound wasn't just noise. It was a physical thing that hit you like a wall. The pressure wave compressed the air and made your ears pop. Trees that had stood for decades were shredded into splinters. The ground fountained upward in columns of dirt and smoke and shrapnel. The 6 scouts felt the blast wash over them, even from 200 metres away, hot air and dust and the smell of explosive. And then the artillery didn't stop. Fire for effect meant continuous fire, shells raining down one after another after another. The guns fired in rotation, so there was always a shell in the air. 1 shell every 15 seconds. 4 guns meant a shell landing every few seconds, walking back and forth across the target area like a giant invisible hammer pounding the earth. From 6:53 to 7:06, 13 minutes, the rubber plantation became hell on earth. High explosive shells tore through the trees. White phosphorus marker rounds burst into clouds of burning chemical smoke. Tree bursts were the worst, shells that detonated in the canopy and sent shrapnel raining straight down on anyone below. There was nowhere to hide. The VC tried to scatter, but the artillery followed them, adjusting based on corrections from the scout patrol. When groups of soldiers ran one direction, the shells walked that way. When they tried to go another direction, more shells landed there. Then the secondary explosion started. The VC had stacked ammunition boxes together, mortars and rifle rounds and RPG warheads all in one place. When the artillery hit those stockpiles, they detonated in massive blasts that were even bigger than the artillery shells. Mortars cooked off in rapid succession, bang, bang, bang like firecrackers. Small arms ammunition boxes caught fire and bullets started cooking off in all directions. thousands of rounds going off at once in a sustained crackle that sounded like a forest fire made of gunfire. The sounds layered on top of each other until they became one continuous roar. The crump, crump, crump of artillery shells, the whoosh and crack of secondaries, screaming that started and then stopped, trees crashing down, metal fragments whistling through the air. And underneath it all, a rumble that you felt in your bones, the earth itself shaking from the violence being poured into it. Smoke rose above the jungle canopy, a column of grey and black that could be seen from kilometers away. It was a signal to everyone in the area that something terrible had just happened. Birds fled in flocks, animals ran, and in the Australian base, soldiers stopped what they were doing and looked east toward that rising smoke and wondered what could make the earth shake like that. At 7:06, the patrol commander radioed ceasefire. The guns fell silent. The jungle fell silent. Not even birds made sounds anymore, just the ringing aftermath of explosions and distant crackling of fires. The smell of cordite drifted through the rubber trees, bitter and chemical. Small fires burned here and there where white phosphorus had landed. Trees that were still standing were stripped of leaves and bark, just white splintered wood pointing at the sky. The 6 Australians didn't move forward to check their work. That would have been suicide. Even if most of the VC were dead or wounded, survivors would be disoriented, terrified, angry, and still armed. 6 men walking into that kill zone would be torn apart. Instead, the patrol did what they had been trained to do. They pulled back slowly and carefully, moving away from the target area toward a landing zone where helicopters could pick them up. They set claymore mines behind them as they moved, just in case anyone tried to follow. Later, intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations would piece together what happened in those 14 minutes. 245 confirmed enemy killed, more than 350 wounded, many of them critically. Out of the 600 soldiers who had been in that rubber plantation, less than 10% walked away without injury. D445 Battalion was combat ineffective and wouldn't be able to fight for 3 months. The 275 VC Regiment withdrew all the way back to Cambodia to rebuild. The planned assault on Nui Dat Base never happened. The VC had been shattered before they ever got to attack. Australian casualties from the entire operation, 0. 6 men walked into the jungle and 6 men walked out. Captured VC later described the artillery strike as hell falling from the sky. They said the jungle itself had attacked them. They said they learned that day to fear small Australian patrols more than large American operations, because the small patrols were the ones that called down the fire. Post-war accounts from Vietnamese veterans acknowledged that after strikes like this, VC units would avoid areas where they knew Australian scouts operated. The fear was real, and it lasted. In 14 minutes, 6 men with radios and patience had destroyed a force 100 times their size. They had done it without firing a single shot themselves. They had proven that in jungle warfare, the side that sees first doesn't just have an advantage. The side that sees first has already won. Within a few weeks, what those 6 Australians did became standard practice for the entire task force. Small patrols, moving slow, watching and waiting, calling in fire when they found targets. The Australian method spread through the units in Phuoc Tuy province. Officers studied the results and realized this was how you fought in the jungle. Not with aggression and noise, but with silence and patience and overwhelming firepower when the moment was right. But the American units mostly refused to change. Their doctrine was built on different ideas. Find the enemy, close with the enemy, destroy the enemy with direct fire. That meant moving fast, covering ground, forcing contact. The idea of spending 2 weeks to move 2 kilometers seemed like a waste of time. The idea of watching instead of fighting seemed passive, even cowardly. The cultural gap was too wide. Americans wanted body count numbers they could put in reports. They wanted visible action. They wanted to feel like they were doing something, not just sitting in the jungle watching. So the Australians kept using their methods in their area of operations, and the Americans kept using theirs in most other places. And the results spoke for themselves. Australian SAS patrols achieved kill ratios of 20-1 or higher. For every Australian soldier killed, 20 or more enemy died. They had 60 to 70% fewer casualties than American units fighting in similar jungle terrain. They provided coordinates for 40% of all effective artillery missions in Phuoc Tuy province. By every tactical measure, they were winning. The VC changed how they operated in response. They stopped concentrating in large groups in areas where Australian patrols operated. They relied more on tunnel networks where artillery couldn't reach them. They moved at night in smaller groups. They avoided leaving tracks. They became even more careful and more hidden. The psychological effect was huge. VC units that had fought confidently for years became afraid of ghosts in the jungle, afraid of patrols they never saw until the artillery started falling. The patrol commander who led those 6 men survived his tour in Vietnam. He went home to Australia and trained the next generation of SAS soldiers. He taught them the same lessons he had learned in Malaya and proven in Vietnam. Move slowly, watch everything, be patient, see first, shoot first, win. Some of the men from that patrol died in later operations, killed by mines or ambushes, or just bad luck. The jungle took them eventually, the way it took so many others. War in the jungle was never safe, even when you did everything right. The statistics proved the Australian methods worked. Kill ratios of 18-22 enemy killed for every Australian lost. Casualty rates that were dramatically lower than American units. Intelligence that was more accurate and more useful. They had figured out how to win in the jungle. They had mastered an environment that had defeated larger armies. They had shown that small teams with the right training and tactics could dominate forces that outnumbered them 100-1. And yet, the war went on. Strategic Hamlet programs failed. Pacification efforts stalled. The South Vietnamese government remained corrupt and unstable. American public support collapsed. Political will eroded. You could win every single patrol action, every single firefight, every single tactical engagement, and still lose the war. Because wars aren't won by tactics alone. They're won by strategy, by politics, by whether the people back home believe in what you're fighting for. The bitter truth was that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome strategic confusion. The Australians proved you could control territory in the jungle. They proved you could make the enemy afraid to move in daylight. They proved you could find and destroy enemy forces with minimal friendly casualties. But none of that answered the bigger questions. Why were they there? What were they trying to achieve? When would it be enough? In 1975, the last helicopter lifted off from the American embassy in Saigon. The North Vietnamese army rolled into the city with tanks. The war that had killed millions of people was over, and the side that all those tactical victories had been won against was the side that won in the end. All the successful patrols, all the favorable kill ratios, all the enemy units destroyed, none of it had been enough. But the lessons survived. The tactics that the Australians perfected in Vietnam became the foundation of modern special operations around the world. Navy SEALs studied them, Army Rangers studied them, British SAS studied them, learning from their Australian cousins. The idea of small teams with superior training operating independently in hostile territory, that became standard. The patient hunter approach, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike, that became doctrine. When American Special Operations Forces went into Iraq and Afghanistan decades later, they used methods that would have been familiar to those 6 Australians in the rubber plantation. Small teams, silent movement, indigenous knowledge, patience over aggression, intelligence over body count. See first, shoot first, survive. The tactical lessons from Vietnam's jungles worked in Afghanistan's mountains and Iraq's cities. What failed strategically in Vietnam succeeded tactically, and those tactics lived on. Today, the rubber plantation east of Nui Dat is farmland. Vietnamese families grow crops in soil that was torn apart by 200 artillery shells in 14 minutes. The jungle has reclaimed the shell craters. Trees grow where trees were destroyed. The land healed itself the way land always does. Occasionally, farmers find rusted metal in the ground, old shell fragments, pieces of equipment, things that were left behind by armies that came and went and are now just memories. The lesson isn't that firepower wins wars, because it doesn't. The lesson isn't that courage wins wars, because that's not enough either. The lesson is older and simpler. In any fight, seeing the enemy before they see you is the oldest tactical advantage in human history. 6 men with radios and patience achieved what battalions with helicopters could not achieve. They proved that warfare isn't about size or strength. It's about who understands the terrain. It's about who moves with discipline. It's about who sees first and shoots first and survives to do it again. The jungle remembers in its own way. The silence after violence remembers. And in training camps for special operations forces all around the world, instructors still tell the story of August 18th, 1966, when 6 Australians destroyed a regiment in less time than it takes to eat breakfast. They tell the story because the lesson matters. They tell it because tactical excellence never goes out of style. They tell it because somewhere, someday, another small team will walk into hostile territory and need to remember that patience and precision can defeat any number of enemies, as long as you see them first.